You ready to go?
All set.
Why don't you take it away then?
Okay. Everybody bear with me a little bit because my allergies are kicking in. But we'll try and get through. Okay, so this is the next part of our performance tuning WebEx sessions. Today's agenda, we're going to cover mostly update statistics. We'll talk about what are the table level statistics the engine keeps, and what are the data distributions, and at what level it keeps them, what it's done at the fragment level, and for stored procedures and functions. We'll also talk about user-defined types a little bit, okay, and then we'll talk about Dostats and how you can use that to get a usable quality of data distributions for your server. And we'll also take a look at some of the other utilities that are in the my utils2_ak package, which is where you'll find Dostats. Okay. So what does the engine do when you run update statistics? You run update statistics low. The engine gathers certain low-level statistics in the systables catalog table. Among that, it keeps track of the current number of rows, the number of pages used by the table, and the time that the low-level stats were last executed. Okay. In syscolumns, for each column in the table, it keeps track of, in the column in and column max columns, the second lowest value and the second highest value. That's used by the lowest, oldest level of the optimizer. If you think of the optimizer like the human brain, deep inside we've got a lizard brain. So the original Informix 5 optimizer is still in there somewhere, and it depends on these values. It only keeps the first 4 bytes of each of the column in and column max in an encoded format. Okay. For sysindices and sysindexes, which is a view over that table in 11, it keeps the percentage of the data that's still clustered if the index is a clustered index. It records the depth of the index in the levels column, the width of the leaf in the level of the index, the number of unique keys that the index holds, and the number of total number of keys in the index. And again, it keeps in the UST low TS the time that the low-level stats were last executed. When you run an update statistics medium, you gather additional information. Okay, it keeps track of the I/O count since the table was created as of the time that the update statistics command was run, and it also calculates data distributions and histograms. You can control the quality of the medium distributions, which are sampling, with 3 optional parameters. The resolution parameter lets you specify how finely the distributions are divided up, how many buckets. The default resolution is 2.5%, which gives you 40 buckets in general. Obviously, per table it doesn't have that many. Per column it doesn't have that many values, so fewer buckets. And the default confidence, which you can specify also, is 95%. So the probability is that the medium statistics will be as good as high statistics. By default is 95%, and you can adjust that. You can also adjust the sampling rate, either the total number of records that are sampled or the percent of the rows in the table that are sampled. The default is a calculated sampling level depending on the confidence. Okay, and by default, it doesn't sample a whole lot of records, even for a very large table. A few 100,000 rows, I believe, is the maximum number of rows that it samples. So for larger tables, you may want to adjust the sampling rate manually. For update statistics high, the engine again gathers the I/O count since the table was created as of the moment you begin running the update statistics command, and it records that in the sysdescript record for that column. and it, again, calculates data distributions. Okay. And this time, for high, the engine either reads an entire index, every key in the index, if that's all it has to do, or it reads every data row in the table. If you're doing update statistics on a column that doesn't lead an index. You do have some control over the quality of the high distribution, but only in the sense that you can control the resolution or the number of buckets in the distribution histogram. By default, that's 0.5% or 200 buckets. For data that is highly skewed or has a tremendous number of distinct values, you may want to adjust the resolution upwards. Now, in addition, if you have a fragmented table, okay, and we'll talk about when this kicks in, the engine may keep information in this fragments table. Again, the number of pages used in the fragment, the number of rows in the fragment. For index fragments, the cluster percent and the levels of the index are kept, similar to what's kept in sys tables and sys indices. Okay. When you update statistics, medium or high, okay, you can, at the fragment level, if you have stat level set to fragment or to auto, and certain criteria are met, the engine will begin to keep fragment level distributions. Okay, and those criteria are here. Fragment level distributions are calculated if the partitioning scheme is not a round robin. So basically, interval list expression or rolling window based partitioning scheme. It will not calculate fragment level distributions for a round robin table because there's no way of knowing what data is in which fragments at runtime. If you have a sys SV space name defined in your on-config file, which is a valid SV space, and your stat level is set to auto, and the table has more than 1 million rows. So until the table reaches 1 million rows, the fragment level distributions will not be calculated. It'll just use table level distributions. So auto statistics mode. In your on-config file, there's a parameter auto stat mode. This does not have anything to do with AUS or the auto update statistics feature, but it is new in 11.7. It controls whether or not the statistics and distributions are actually calculated. Okay. When it's turned off, when it's set to 0 and disabled, then the behavior of update statistics is the same as it was in 11.50 and earlier versions. Statistics are always calculated if you have to ask for them. If you set auto stat mode to 1 in your on-config file, then the statistics for a table are only gathered if it meets certain criteria, which we'll go over. Okay. You can override the auto stat mode when you're running update statistics. You can say, oh, update statistics, blah, blah, and you have the force option to the end of the command, and that will force statistics and distributions to be calculated, even if the table doesn't otherwise meet the criteria. Okay. Or if you have the default set to off and it's always on, and you want the auto stat mode behavior, you can say update statistics, blah, blah, with the auto keyword. And that will have cause update statistics to obey the criteria that are set, even if that's not the default. Okay. The stat change parameter in the on-config file controls the default selection criteria that the auto stat mode uses when it's enabled. You set it to a % of change. So it compares the number of data rows, data pages in the table that have been modified by an insert or delete or an update since the last time the stats were gathered. So if you remember when we talked about what's stored when you update statistics, it keeps track of the number of inserts, deletes, and updates since the beginning of the table. At the moment you run the update, you ran the update statistics last. When you go to run the update statistics again, it compares those stored values to the current live values for the table and calculates the % change. And if more than stat change % of your records or your pages have been modified, or likely to have been modified since the last time stats were calculated, then the update statistics will actually do something. If not, it will be a no-up. It'll just return right away without doing anything. You can override the default stat change that's in the onConfig file at the table level. You can do an alter table, table name, stat change, and set the percentage or the keyword auto. Auto means default. Use the default value in the onConfig file, or you can set the percent change to anything from 0 to 100%. 0 means always calculate stats. So that brings us back to the original behavior before 1170, where stats were always calculated. You have some table that's highly volatile, and you always want update statistics always execute for it. You can set the stat change level for that table to 0. One question I often get, people ask me, what is the best way to calculate update statistics? So the very best statistics you can possibly get would be to run high on every column in the table individually, one column at a time, with a fragment level, distributions enabled for partition tables, and with the number of buckets or the resolution sets high enough that there are the same number of buckets as the number of unique values in the column. In other words, you end up with one bucket for every column or something close to it, and absolutely accurate statistics, and to run them nearly every day so that they're always accurate. That's the best stats, okay? It is also the slowest way to calculate your stats. It's going to take forever to run on a significantly sized database. So what do we do about that? Okay. What we want to do is find a mean and a happy medium, a zen, for update statistics. Like everything else we do as DBAs, like most things in life, we want to strive for a balance. So how do we get a balance? The ideal balance is found in the Informix Performance Guide. In the Performance Guide, under the section about update statistics, there is a chart, a table, or an outline that lists the things you need to do to get usable level of stats with a minimal amount of work. And that's what we're going to go over now. So you need to do an update statistics high on the leading column of each index so that you have the best stats for the optimizer to select one index over another. You also want to do a high on the first column of each index when multiple indexes start with the same list of columns. You want to do an update statistics high on the first column of that index that's different. So if you have an index that starts with columns A, B, and C, another index that starts with columns A, B, and D, then you need to do a high not only on A, but also on B and D, on C and D, but not necessarily on B, okay? Because B is the same for the two indexes. Medium stats are enough for the optimizer to make it a good decision, and we save some processing by doing that, okay? Optionally, I would suggest you want to do a high on any columns that are used in a partitioning scheme, right, in a fragment by expression or fragment by list. But it doesn't have, if you don't have an index on that column already, that leaves that column already. You'd also want to do a high on columns that are used as important filters and join conditions frequently in your system. Not on every join condition column. Medium is good enough for most. But there are certain columns that are used in almost all of your queries for many joins. On those columns, you might want to do a high also, especially if you're seeing some performance problems. Currently, DoStats doesn't have a direct option to implement those two features, and AUS doesn't implement them either. But there's something you may want to do manually. Okay. Now, you also need to do a medium on every column that does not qualify for a high. So that's all your index columns that are not lead columns or the different column between two indexes. It's also all the columns that are not indexed. And the performance guide suggests you do an update statistics low on each full index key, okay, and DoStats does that. There is a debate within Informix, within the group that maintains the optimizer about whether this last step is necessary. and we'll talk about it later, AUS does not implement this step. Dostats does. So we're on different sides of the debate. You also need to update statistics for all of your routines, all your stored procedures and stored functions after you run update statistics on the tables that they reference, so that the stored procedures are recompiled and pick up a new query plan based on the new data distributions that you've just calculated. Otherwise, the first time they run, the stored procedure is going to recompile itself, which is fine. Before Informix 11.10, you would have gotten a 7.10 error when that happened. But now that you won't get a 7.10 error. However, if you have a very busy server, multiple users will try to recompile those procedures the first time they run them. Many of them will get lock errors trying to update the sys proc plan table. So if you're seeing that, it's because somebody updated statistics or otherwise altered a table and caused the query plans in the stored procedure to become invalid, causing the procedure to attempt to recompile itself for multiple users all at the same time. Better to just recompile all your stored procedures with update statistics right after you recompile, calculate distributions for your tables, okay, by running update statistics. The recompiles are very fast, even if your procedures are rather long, so it doesn't add much to the processing time. Okay. Be very careful that you set PDQ priority 0 before recompiling your stored procedures and functions, because any stored procedure that's compiled with a non-zero PDQ priority will run with that PDQ priority for every user. And if you have a non-trivial PDQ priority set so that your update statistics run faster, then your stored procedures are going to single thread through the engine when your users try to run them later, and that's a bad thing. Okay. Auto update statistics. Informix 11.x includes, and later includes, one of the tasks that's delivered with the task manager, okay, or two of the tasks really, a set of tasks that implement nightly update statistics processing. So you don't necessarily have to manually do anything to maintain statistics and distributions if you want to rely on AUS to do that for you, okay? There are, though, a couple of problems that I perceive with auto-update statistics and why I tend to disable it in databases that I manage. The AUS evaluator task, which is the first task that runs, is rather slow and uses a lot of resources, CPU and I/O resources. The version that's in Informix 12.10 is somewhat better. They did a lot of work to improve it. It's still a little bit slow, and the resource use is still higher than I'd like to see it. The biggest problem with that is that if you have a large database with a lot of tables, especially if you have a lot of DB spaces, which slows down processing the update statistics, and especially running the evaluator, then it may be that your evaluator will not have finished by the time the AUS refresh task starts, especially if you haven't adjusted the default scheduling. By default, the refresh task starts an hour after the evaluator task. So it may be that the refresh task will kick off before the evaluator is finished and will only process some of your tables because the list of procedures or steps that it has to go through will not have been completed when it starts up. So you need to be careful about that if you have a large number of tables to make sure that you check the scheduling of the two tasks. Okay. As I said, AUS does not run alone on each full index key. There is a debate about whether that makes a difference. Some people have tested and found that it doesn't make a difference. The only thing I know for sure is that besides this problem and the fact that AUS does not calculate distributions on non-indexed columns, we're pretty much, Dostats and AUS are pretty much doing the same thing. And all I know is when I see performance problems that are statistics related, if I run Dostats, things are better. And so I put that cause on AUS not performing these two steps.
Art, we just lost sound for a minute. You might want to repeat the last few sentences.
Oh, sure. Where did you lose me?
Right, just about 2 minutes ago.
On the previous slide?
No, on this slide.
Okay. So what I was saying was the AUS doesn't calculate the low on the full index key, as I mentioned earlier, and it doesn't calculate any distributions at all on non-indexed columns unless you already have them calculated in your tables. It will duplicate what's there if it finds distributions for those columns. But on a clean database, it will not calculate distributions on non-indexed columns. So whether or not these two steps are necessary, some people do testing and find that it doesn't make a difference whether you do this or not. My understanding, the only thing I know for sure is that when I've seen problems that I can relate to data distributions not being up to date or not being sufficient, if I run Dostats, which other than these two steps pretty much does the same thing AUS does, things improve. And so I put a lot of weight on these two steps. So, you know, that's for you to evaluate. Okay. Also, AUS doesn't recompile stored procedures. It leaves them to auto-compile the next time they're run. And again, if you have a lot of users, that can cause problems for some of those users the first time they try to run the stored procedure and all try to compile it at the same time. Okay. And it's not simple to configure AUS unless you use OAT. If you like to use OAT, that's great. It's easy to configure in OAT. If you're not using OAT and you want to adjust the configuration parameters, which we'll look at shortly, then it's a little more complicated. Okay, you have to go modify records in the sysadmin database manually. Okay, there are only a few control options you have beyond runtime scheduling for AUS. One of them is the AUS age parameter, which defines how old data distributions have to be before the AUS evaluator considers them stale and tells the refresh task to update stats for that table or for that column. AUS change, which defines the percent change that the AUS evaluator uses to determine which tables, again, to tell the refresh task to run. It doesn't override stat change. Okay, so if you set AUS change to a lower value than stat change, the refresh may run and update statistics for that column or that table, but stat change may prevent it from actually doing anything. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. There's no way to put a force option on in AUS, by the way. There's the AUS small tables, defines the number of rows that the AUS evaluator uses to determine if a table is small. If AUS says a table is small, it just does a hide on the whole table, making its calculation simpler, and possibly getting you slightly better statistics for that table. Okay. Dostats does not have that optimization. That's an AUS thing, and not bad. And then there's AUS auto rules. Okay. If you set that to 0, then the AUS evaluator will present the refresh task with update statistics commands that mimic what's already in the database. If you set AUS auto rules to 1, then the evaluator will calculate new update statistics based on its own rules. So again, it won't generate any distributions for columns that are not indexed at all, for example. Okay. One of the ways you can get your stats is to use my MySchema utility, which we'll talk about later in more depth, but it has an option --distributions-file, and you give it a file name that will generate a set of update statistics commands to duplicate the distributions and stats that are already in your database. So that's equivalent to running auto update statistics with auto rules set to 0. Okay. So you can do that quickly using that. And since that's fairly static, you can just do that once into a file and execute that as a script, as an SQL script. Okay. Dostats, on the other hand, faithfully implements the recommendations in the performance guide, and it's optimized for best performance. Okay, so it does certain things to make sure that the commands it runs will operate and execute efficiently. It also has many options, which lets you control exactly what it's doing. The most important ones I've listed on the next couple of slides. There is an option to force override stat mode, okay, and there's also an option to force it to obey the stat mode and stat level and other AUS settings. You can use the AUS age and AUS change settings with Dostats. If you have them already set in your database, there's an option to Dostats to use those for its own aging and change management calculations, or you can specify those on the command line to Dostats. You can tell it to process a list of tables, a specific list of tables rather than all tables, or a single table. You can tell it to process all tables except a given list of tables. You can process one database only or all the databases in your server. You can optionally tell it to include catalog tables, which I would strongly suggest you do periodically on a production machine, maybe once or twice a year. But on a development machine, I would do it every single time, since the catalog tables are updated frequently on a development machine, even sometimes on a Q&A machine. So there I would do that more frequently. It can optionally report the runtime for each operation. It will also report it at summary level, so it will tell you how long it took to run each update statistics command and how long it took to run all the commands for a particular table and for a particular database, for example. You can also optionally have it report the clock time when the command started. So that was requested by some users who wanted to be able to log the output from Dostats, and if they had any performance problems at a particular time, they could go back to the Dostats log and see if Dostats happened to be running a particular command on a particular table at the time the problem was reported. So you can do that. You can adjust the resolution, the confidence, and the sampling for medium, and obviously the resolution for your high distributions, all independently of each other, okay, at the database level. And since you can, at the run level, and since you can always specify which tables are processed or which tables are ignored, you can group your tables together into separate lists and run them at different resolutions. Okay. Optionally, with Dostats, you can run the commands immediately. You can have Dostats calculate what to do and do it right away. You can have it write the SQL to a file so you can process it later in a cron or manually. You can also have it install a stored procedure to process your commands and optionally to schedule that procedure to run at a particular time, either once or periodically, every day, every week, every month. Okay. Optionally, Dostats will drop all your distributions before it starts. That's something you need to do after you do a server upgrade, so that's an option the Dostats can make life easy. There's an option to drop the distributions for each table before beginning to process that table. That's needed when you use drive Dostats script, which we'll talk about later, to execute and to update your stats for multiple tables in parallel after a server upgrade. You can also specify a maximum error count in case your update statistics commands run into locks or something else. You can specify after n errors, give up and quit, so that you're not impacting some large batch job that's causing Dostats problems, but also inversely, Dostats may be causing problems for those jobs. There's also a Dostats version included in the utils 2 AK package for older engines prior to version 10, because the optimizations needed to run your update stacks efficiently is a little bit different in the earlier versions of the engine. So that older version is still available. It's in the package, and you can substitute that when you build the package. Okay. You can also replace AUS, both the evaluator and the refetch task, with Dostats. In my blog in May 2011, I posted detailed instructions how to do that. That's the link to the blog, to that specific blog entry. It includes scripts that you can use to install Dostats as a periodic refresh task and also as an evaluated task. Okay. Any questions on update statistics and Dostats before we move on? If you have a question, either click the raise your hand button or type something into the chat window for Lester or for me. Otherwise, I'll move on.
Question is to type it into the chat window and send it to Art or myself or to everybody, and we'll all see it that way.
Okay, we'll move on. If you do have a question, type up one way or the other. Send the chat to Lester in case I'm not paying attention, and we'll stop what we're doing and talk about it. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about some of the other utilities in the utils 2 AK package. The first one in there is my schema, which is my replacement for DB schema. It implements every function that DB schema does with the exception of -HD to display your data distributions. Unfortunately, the data distributions are encoded and encrypted so that they're safe from prying eyes or not authorized to run DB schema HD, and so I can't decode them in my schema. If I ever figure out how to do that, I will include that functionality, but for now that's not there. I believe that my schema's schema output is prettier than DB schema, so that's one of the reasons I maintain the code. Another major reason that I maintain the code is that it explicitly creates implicit indexes. So when you create a constraint, the engine will build an index to support that constraint if that index key doesn't already exist. But the index it creates will be hidden and will have a name that you can't use to alter its extents or rebuild it if it needs to be rebuilt. Okay, so if you use DB schema to port, use my schema to port your development schemas to production, the production version of the schema will have explicitly named indexes, which will be easier for you to manage. And you don't have to beat your developers over the head to create their indexes before they create their constraints. It also has options to adjust the first and next extent sizes. You can optionally set it to, the default is to set it to the current extent sizes, the same as DB schema -SS does, but you can optionally set it to the current number of pages in the extents. You can set it to a percentage of the current extents and set your next extent to a % of the first extent. And that percentage can be less than or more than 100%. Excuse me, either percentage. You can set it to be, there's an option you can tell DB schema to minimize the extents if you know that the actual table has shrunk and you haven't packed it recently, then the schema will be generated with an extent size that's too large. There's an option to tell my schema to shrink it down. For fragmented tables, you can specify whether the extent size for the fragment should be the minimum extent size, the size of the smallest extent for any fragment, or the maximum extent for any fragment, or the average size of the fragments. Okay. Optionally, you can tell my schema to suppress the owners of all the objects. Right? If you run a DB schema, it always outputs the ownerships. Optionally, also you can tell it to change the ownership from whatever it is to a specific user for every object. So you can take your development schemas and move them over to production and set the --set owner equals Informix, and all of your objects will be owned by Informix when you create them using that schema on production. The output ordering is optional. You can, by default, it runs in create order, but optionally you can set it to output the objects in name order, or you can just direct it to output in the latest version of my schema in dependency order. So it will order your tables so that dependent tables are created after the tables they depend on. Okay, that was put in there to improve the processing for my DB export replacement utility, my export. But it's there for you to use. My export can also separate the DBL into multiple files. It will put the, if you give it 2 file names on the command line, it will put the create table statements in the first file, and it'll put everything else in the second file. Optionally, you can have privilege statements directed to a third file. You can have the update, the statistics commands to support your tables, your database put into a 4th file, etc. Okay. You can optionally add the conditional creation syntax, create table if not exists. You can have that added to the schema in case you're using this to update a schema. You can generate a DB import compatible schema file if you want some of the options that my schema can produce for you to be processed by DB import. Then you can replace the one that DB export created for you with one generated by my export. You can also optionally generate a list of API commands to defragment your tables. Edwin, is that a question? Edwin? Okay. If you have a question, Edwin, just open up a chat window. If you pull down the bar at the top, there's a selection for chat. Open a chat window and send it to Lester, and we'll break in with it. Okay. API commands, yeah. So there's an option that will generate a list of API commands to defragment your tables. Really easy, so you don't have to do a lot of typing. Like most of my utilities, all these options exist because I was too lazy to type them myself, and there was a need for it. There's an option to add the online keyword to create index statements. So during the schema creation, indexes will be created in online mode. You can generate infrastructure scripts just like DB schema minus C does. Okay, and you can create them either using API commands or using the command line on spaces and on params utilities. It will create either kind of script, and you can use it on our engines earlier than 11.70, where the DB schema does not have support for creating an infrastructure script to duplicate your server. Okay, it will generate a script optionally to duplicate all your update statistics commands, as I mentioned earlier. Okay. The DB delete utility is the fastest way to delete large numbers of rows from your table without worrying about rollbacks and one transaction rollbacks, because it does partial commits every N records. It's very low overhead. It works best for tables that are for non-fragmented tables or fragmented tables with row IDs, but you can use it for fragmented tables that don't have row IDs. Because you have the option to specify a key to use to select records for deletion, although it will run more slowly in that mode. It locks and commits only a small number of records at a time. You can adjust that by adjusting the size of the buffer that it fetches. Okay, the number of records anywhere from 512 to 8,192, because the maximum buffer size that you can set right now is 32K. Okay, and it's efficient enough that you can divide and conquer, break your table up into fairly independent blocks of row IDs, and run multiple DB deletes to clean the table up very, very fast. Okay. Not as fast as a truncate if you want to get rid of everything, but it's much faster than just doing a delete. DB copy is a very fast, low overhead data copy utility. It was created originally so I could move data from an unlogged database to a logged database, so it does that. by keeping separate connections on each of the two databases, on the source and the target. Those source and target can be a single database, that can be multiple databases in the same server, or multiple databases across multiple servers. It actually runs fastest if it's running on a third machine, copying data from one database to another, from one server to another. That's where you can get the best throughput, absolutely, especially if your network is very fast. It does partial commit, so it avoids long transaction rollbacks, and there's an option to copy without replication. Okay. Any records that it can't insert are logged to a flat file in unload format, so you can correct the data and reload it later. Okay. There are some notes, though, using dbcopy. It doesn't handle user-defined types or clobs or blobs unless you want to go into the source and add that feature for yourself. And if you want to contribute it back to the community, let me know, and I will be happy to include that code. It will also choke and possibly produce garbage if you have more than one text or byte column in your table. And I have not put code in to protect you from doing that, so be aware. That's a buyer beware kind of thing. There's also a bug in all the new versions of the CSDK and the engine that actually affects both. Since 1150XC5 and the corresponding CSDK that goes with it, it causes a bogus -1831 error if you try and use dbcopy on a table that has no varchar column. It reports that you can't use fetch array code with auto re-prepare or one of those features, doesn't matter. The error is bogus. It's actually because they broke the fetch array code in that version, and after. It still has not been fixed as far as I know, as of CSDK 4.10.xc2, which is the latest. Okay. Because of that, I developed a new utility, dbmove. It gets around all of these problems with dbcopy. It's not quite as fast, but it's darn close. It uses all the algorithms that dbdelete uses to copy blocks of rows again, but it uses insert into select from and with a row ID list. Okay, so it's rather fast. It will handle multiple clobs and blobs and UDT columns and multiple byte and text columns, and it doesn't do fetch array, so it has no problem doing varchars. So it gets around that bug, and it's nearly as fast. By the way, you can use either dbcopy or dbmove to import data from an external table into a real table, and doing so will be as fast as using the external tables by themselves, maybe a little bit faster. Okay, it will be faster than the HP loader, doing something similar in express mode anyway. Drive Dostats is a script that comes in the package that allows you to run to divide your database across multiple copies of Dostats so that you can process your tables in parallel. If you have a multi-CPU machine and you've got the cycles to spare or a quiet time in your processing day, when you can do that, you can get your statistics updated very, very quickly by using Drive Dostats to run 4 or 8 or 16 copies of Dostats. It divides the tables up, lists them by size, and either processes them largest first or smallest first, and distributes the first n largest tables to n copies of Dostats, and then the next largest n copies, or the next smallest, etc. Okay. You can exclude a list of tables on the command line or in a file. You can also hand it a file of a command line or a file with tables to only include. And most Dostats options are passed through to Dostats, except the -I and -X include and exclude options, which are processed directly by Drive Dostats itself. Okay. There's a utility UL that when you build the package will also create 2 links to it, bload and bunload, which are just the same as running UL-L for bload or UL-U for bunload. Those bload, bunload names are taken from sample utilities that are in your demo directory with your engine, but these are different utilities. They do something similar. It will unload your table to a binary format file or load that binary format file back into a table. There are options to use buffered, unbuffered, or asynchronous I/O. There's an option to use an insert. Actually, it always does insert pushes, and it always does partial commits, so it doesn't have a problem with long transactions. So you can load data very quickly because it's a binary file, and usually a little smaller than a text file, a load or unload file. There's an option to insert without replication, and you can specify a commit size. For an unload, you can also specify a file size. If the file fills up, it will just start another file so that you can make your file smaller and easier to transport. There's an option to create a swapped format file, which is portable between machines, between different processor types, big endian, little endian. It's a portable format. And the no swap mode files are compatible with Informix mode external tables, which are binary format files also, and that file format is compatible. So you can unload a table into a file and create an external table to point to the file, and you'll be able to read it. There's a utility dbstruct. Dbstruct takes a table name and a database name and optionally a table name and creates structures for header files for your developers. It has some options. By default, it does what it shows here. It creates a C structure, okay? But there's an option to create an ESQL-C declaration, including the begin, declare section, and declare section statements. And if you do that, it also uses string instead of char, so that the strings are null terminated when they're fetched instead of space padded. There's an option to create 4GL records. There's an option even to create structured Fortran records because I used to code in Fortran and I still like it. There's a similar utility, SQL struct, that does the same thing but for the results of a select statement. By default, it prompts you on the command line to type in the select, but you can put it in a file or on the command line also, optionally. And it will, again, generate structures in various formats. So you can easily create header files. Save your developers a lot of typing and a lot of time. Okay. There's a utility DBS avail, which produces this TB space summary report, which shows the free pages and free kilobytes of your DB spaces and blob spaces and FB spaces. If you see it, look on the right, it will tell you the page size for the space and whether it's an FB space or a temporary space or a temporary SB space or a blob space, etc. Okay, or by default just a normal DB space. Okay. It does install a stored procedure in the systemaster database. You have to run it as root to do that. Not as root, I'm sorry, as Informix to do that. The stored procedure is small. It just does the calculations, actually generates these numbers. So once the procedure's in there, you can use it in other scripts of your own to generate different reports. Okay. There's a utility DB script that will process your table names and output whatever command you tell it to output. That could be SQL commands, it could be shell script commands. So just an easy way to quickly generate a command against every table in your database. Okay. It takes as the argument to the -T any matches wildcards, so you can specify subsets of your tables that way using wildcards. Okay. So this one is setting the stat change for a bunch of tables. Okay. There's a utility list DB7, which prints out details of your databases. If you just run it by itself, it just lists the database names with the -D option. It also tells you about the database, what DB space it lives in, what kind of logging it has, whether there's what the lock mode of the database is, and whether it's a GLS database, and when it was created. Okay. Oh, and who owns it also. Okay. Optionally, there's a -T option, which will also display the tables that are in the database and the indexes on each table and tell you about their extents. So it's kind of a quick report about what's in your database. There's a utility print-free-B that prints out a summary report that's similar to the onCheck -PT report. It's still in the package. I created it long before there was an onCheck PT, but it's a similar report. So it'll tell you how many pages are in your table and how full they are. Whether the tables are full or partially full or almost empty, that kind of thing. Okay. And that's pretty much it. Do we have any questions? Nobody? All right, if you're still thinking of your question, we've got a few minutes left. Type in and let us know. Our next webcast is on February 20th, also at 2 p.m., same time, on using IWA to accelerate your queries.
It's actually, we want to show another BI product called Yellowfin, working with Accelerator. And one of the advantages of Yellowfin is you can do BI queries on an iPad. So if I can get the camera angle right, we'll have an iPad doing queries against an Informix database.
Very cool. Okay. Also, keep in mind,
a couple of questions have come in.
Great.
Let me just say, can we get the slides? And the answer, I think, is, Art, you're going to send the slides to me, and then I can put them on the website?
Yes.
And just because of the holidays, and I've got some travel, it probably won't be up there until next week. We recorded this webcast, and you'll be able to get a recording and tell your friends about it. Art's webcast #1 that we did has been the most popular one we've ever done, and it's had a huge number of hits on YouTube. And we'll put this one up there with it. And that's all the questions I see.
Okay. I don't see any. We have, of course, Advanced Data Tools does Informix training. One of our classes is the Advanced Informix Performance Tuning class, where we spend 4 days learning how to make your database server run as fast as it can possibly run. And we look at OLTP databases, and we look at data warehouse databases, and we look at tuning in general. Take my last tuning presentation and spread it over 4 days instead of 1 hour, and we go into much deeper detail. Lester and I usually do that together if we can schedule it out, and that is the plan. The schedule is always on our website, but the current schedule is for the advanced class to be given this March, and we'll also be giving our basic database administrators class at the end of January, and again at the beginning, in the middle of September. Okay, we don't ever cancel a class or reschedule it as long as any student is registered for it. So no matter what, if you registered for the class, you will get the class when it's scheduled. Okay, you can take the class online over the web from home or from your desk at work. Or you can come down to our training center in Virginia, and we'll all sit together in a room and do this together. Okay.
Yeah, and one point I should make: our classes are small. We usually limit them based on the number of servers we have available, and typically that's 6 to 8 servers. So if and it depends on other projects we're doing, but if we only have 6 servers, we're only going to take 6 people in the class. And last year we had 3 classes fill up before the date. And just to highlight, you need to, if you're interested, let us know early and plan and register early. That's the only way to guarantee a place. The January class has already got people registered, and that's well on track. The March class has got people who've told me they're interested in coming, and I expect that to fill up too. So let us know if you're interested, please. Now, here's a great question. It will take a whole hour to answer. Or I'm going to copy the.
Yeah.
I'm going to copy the question. So we'll try. I'm going to copy the question and send it to you.
Okay.
So that you get it right. But it's what are the top 5 resources to monitor Informix, and what are their thresholds?
So the top, basically, what I've done this because I've got the same problem you do. How do I quickly tell what's the status and the health of the engine? If you go onto the IIUD site and download the ratios AK_SHR, I believe it's called, you'll see that package contains a script called newratios.ksh, and it calculates a half a dozen metrics, and those metrics will quickly tell you the health of your engine. And it does install a stored procedure in SysMaster, again, just like DBS Avail does to calculate those metrics, but again, it's very low overhead. The metrics it calculates are the buff weights ratio, okay, which is the ratio of the number of times some users had to wait for a lock on the buffer or a latch on the LRU queues. Mostly it's latches on the LRU queues that are causing the problem. You want that value to be low, typically 6 or less. When it gets above 7, your server is probably seeming slow. If it gets above 10, your phone's probably ringing. The second one is the buffer turnover rate, BTR, which is an estimate of how often you're turning over your buffer cache in an hour. You want that to be single digits. 10 times an hour means you're turning over your buffer cache every 6 minutes. Which is probably just about as often as you want to see it happen in a typical server. There are sometimes the BTR numbers are elevated, so there's a couple of new calculations in there, BTR2 and BTR3, and UBTR, the most important of those is the BTR2. If BTR2 is significantly lower than the BTR, it means that your server probably has a relatively high insert rate versus other operations, and that means you can survive with a higher BTR, okay, because those records that you're inserting are probably only accessed for a few minutes, and then not again until you run summary reports days or weeks later. So you can turn over your buffer cache a little more frequently and still have a happy server. Another one is the read-ahead utilization, RAU, which is the % of your read-ahead pages that are actually being accessed by the server. We want to see that be as close to 100% as possible. And I start to get nervous when it drops below 99.5%. Okay. Most of you who are running 11.7 and 12.10 will not get RAUs even close to that. Part of that is a bug in the RAU. If you're running the version before FC7, the algorithm wasn't quite right. And there's a bug now even in FC7 that is going to be fixed in FC8. I just saw the notice last Thursday. So we may hopefully in FC8 start to see better RAU performance in 11.7. I don't know what version of 12 will have that fixed or if it's even needed. Another one is sequential scan rate, the percentage of your queries that contain a sequential scan. You want that to be very low, a couple of percentage points or less. Another one is the lock weight ratio. You want to see very few lock weights, again, less than 1%. Okay. Those are the primary things that I look at first. If those are healthy, chances are the rest of the server is healthy. Unless there's some specific problem, then that's the first place to look. Okay. So get the ratio script and let that calculate those metrics for you. Anything else, Lester?
No, I think that's it. Thank you, Art. This was another great webcast, and like I said, I'll have this probably. I just sent out a link where we have our past webcast on our website, and I'll have this up there. It'll probably be early next week or this weekend.
All right. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Have a great weekend, good holidays, and a Happy New Year.